Welcome to the video, darlings. I hope you are having a great day, and if not, I hope I can make your day a little better. On this video today, we will be reading You Weren't Supposed to Leave Yet by WaywardSou1, which is in fact yours truly. This fic is rated mature with the archive warnings, graphic depictions of violence, and major character death. The additional tags are Hurt No Comfort, Angst, Whumperless Whump, Blood, Implied self-harm, and major character injury. If any of this content is not to your liking, then please feel free to click off the video now. Today's ship is Jayce/Viktor. This video is in audio format only. An image or GIF will be displayed on screen whilst the audio plays, so you can have this going in the background whilst you work, study, or sleep, and you won't have to worry about missing out on anything visually. Now, without further ado, let's get on with it. It echoed first, the loud ringing that sounded from their backs. Then came the shattering, the fracturing of glass, turning something sturdy into an intricate weapon. The glass sprayed everywhere, scattering across the ground at their feet and through the air, slicing their skin and clothing. Then came the bomb, like the thunder after the lightning. It exploded in their ears as it came to a crescendo all around them, a cacophony of horrible, tumultuous sounds. Jayce saw Mel turn, following her gaze to the weapon that had been unleashed on them. He felt the way his exposed back was assaulted with debris as everything around him was coated with destruction, with debris and dust. He had closed his eyes and been thrown off his feet, unable to even begin to conjure his thoughts into a reaction. He felt his knees hit the hard-polished marble floors, the crack of bone through flesh and skin on solid foundations. He heard the tumbling of brick and metal, and glass fall around him. Punctured throughout the sound of the debris collapsing, he heard voices and screaming, like a record that had been scratched, the sound coming disjointed and harsh on his ears. He felt another body fall beside him, and he held on to it, trying to shield them from the onslaught he couldn't see around him. When the tumbling stopped and the shaking of the floor underneath his feet stopped, he blinked, clearing the dust that had filled his eyes. When he could see once more, he realised the body he was clutching was Mel. She was hunched over, with fear creasing her features. He held her shoulders and tried to speak to her, but his ears were still ringing from the explosion. He shook his head a few times to clear it, the ringing slowly subsiding. He tried again, cupping her frightened face as she looked at him. "Are you okay?" he asked, his throat struggling to keep his voice straight as his own fear crawled over his skin and ate at his insides. The two of them put their heads on a swivel, looking around the room. The entire front of the Count's room had been blown to bits, the walls sitting in huge, scattered chunks around the room, and half buried amongst the rubble with the other council members. Bulbrook was laying under large debris, his head not visible, only an arm in his lower body. Hoskell had a gash on his head, his red and gold uniform spattered with the deep crimson, his eyes glassy and empty. The light all eyes held inside them was missing from his. His mouth was slightly open, like he may have been mid-gasp or shout. He hadn't even had enough time to complete his cry. And then Cassandra, the woman who had supported and helped nurture his endeavours, was left, her lower body trapped under the debris to his left. He crawled to her and shook her shoulders, but her body was cold and lifeless, as if she hadn't been breathing and shouting moments ago. His eyes scanned the room frantically, looking at everyone around him. Salo was being aided by an enforcer to get himself free, his legs trapped beneath the splintered table. A flurry of bright orange had filled the room, with the Noxian warriors accompanied by Ambessa, her wide strides reaching Mel in moments. She spoke, but Jayce didn't hear her, because his eyes finally fell on the last person in the chaos. Viktor was trapped under what seemed to be half of the concrete that used to be the wall. Only one of his arms and his head were free from the debris. His eyes were wide and awake, full of fear, such pure, unrelenting fear, something Jayce had never witnessed before. It was pure and raw and unrefined as Viktor lay there, struggling, groaning, crying. His bone-thin arms weakly scrambling at the lesser pieces of debris that surrounded him, pushing away what he could. Jayce felt his vision cloud over again as dust-filled tears filled his eyes and threatened to spill over. He rushed to Viktor, scraping his hands and knees on the ground as he struggled to stand and get to Viktor amongst the destruction. He began violently ripping at anything that would budge, moving it as far away from Viktor as he could manage in one motion. Viktor could only weakly push at other pieces, his head hardly raised from the ground, and the rest of him unmoving, completely immobile. "I need some help over here!" Jayce called frantically over his shoulder to anyone who could hear him. He tried to lift the largest piece of cement himself. It was part of the ornate wall that held the machinery that allowed the council to entertain their theatrics during their meetings. Metal and concrete, glass and marble surrounded his body. Jayce took hold of the debris and lifted. He pulled at the rock until his fingers stung from the sharp edges, but it wouldn't move. It wouldn't even wobble from where it was. Viktor was crying, soft sobs escaping his mouth as he gasped like a fish out of water. A Noxian soldier, Jayce recognized as Rictus, came to his side. His strength and stature could be likened to that of a bear. Together they attempted once again to lift the debris, but it was no use. Their combined strength wasn't even enough to tilt it. How had an object once so moldable become something so immovable? Viktor coughed, hacking violently before he attempted to speak. Jayce's head flicked to Viktor as he heard him begin to speak, the wet haze still clouding his eyes. "Jayce, we're going to get you out, Viktor. But Jayce didn't know what to do, and Viktor had begun to speak again as his words trailed off into nothing. I can't feel anything below my chest," he rasped weakly. "There's no point." Jayce's heartbeat suddenly worked into overdrive, his breathing shallow and ragged as he stared at Viktor, into his bright yellow eyes which were darkening slowly. No, this wasn't supposed to happen. Jayce tried to lift the debris again. It didn't matter if it hadn't worked the last time. He had to get Viktor out of there. "Jayce," Viktor called, but he ignored it. He didn't want to hear whatever Viktor was going to say. He just needed to get this fucking debris off him. "Jayce, please listen." Jayce continued to pull, push, shove, and lift the rubble, but nothing happened. His hands had begun to bleed, holding onto the jagged edges of the wall. The natural creases in his hand deepened by the weight and the strain. "Jayce!" His voice broke when he yelled. Too much oxygen used in such a short burst ripped at his lungs. "What?" Jayce yelled in turn, looking back at Viktor desperately, the tears having fallen from his face now, leaving warm trails on his cheeks which were covered in dirt. His body was buzzing in all sorts of places from things he couldn't pinpoint, but in the end he was back on his knees again. His lower body curled underneath him as he collapsed beside Viktor. Viktor only tilted his head slightly to look at Jayce better, tears still streaming from his eyes. The part of his body that he could still feel under the debris were burning and stinging. Every nerve ending was alight in the worst way imaginable. There was so much he couldn't feel, so much that was broken beyond use, but still so much that hurt, so much pain he was being consumed by. Jayce shuffled over to Viktor and took his hand with the barest of touches, something so gentle. Viktor had never felt something so tender. Jayce looked at Viktor's hand as he held it. Now ungloved, he could see it was purple. He was confused and didn't understand, but he didn't ask. Not now. Jayce took his head in his other hand and cupped it, keeping it off the dirt and muck underneath it. He saw just below his collarbone from here Viktor had scars on his chest. These weren't from falling debris, these were neat cuts as if from a blade. These were self-inflicted. Jayce was even more confused and afraid, but this wasn't the time. He needed to get Viktor to safety first. As he put his hand under Viktor's, he felt something warm, a lot warmer than Viktor should have been, and wet in a place where it shouldn't have been. Jayce pulled his hand out from the back of Viktor's head to see that same crimson that had coated Councillor Hoskell was now coming from Viktor, and here he could see it, see the rest of the damage. Viktor was lying on the ground that underneath him should have been white, coated in dust. Instead, it was darkened by crimson red. It was Viktor's blood. All of it was Viktor's blood. He'd never seen so much of it in one place, let alone from one person. It was all Viktor's, flowing from his veins and staining the ground beneath him. He imagined the pain, the torment Viktor was in right now. He couldn't do a fucking thing. It caused hysterics to rise in his throat, for his heart to beat faster as if it were compensating for the fact that Viktor's was beginning to slow. Viktor could feel it, the way his body was slowly slipping from him, like whatever life force that kept him tethered to his body was ebbing away and him along with it. He could feel that warmth underneath him. He didn't need to see it to know what it was. He could feel the dizziness in his mind and the hollow feeling in his body. He was fading. It was bright and dark all at once. The only thing he could still see clearly was Jayce's face. A look so horrible etched into his features he almost didn't want to look. He couldn't tell what the look was. It was too many things in one, but he didn't want to see it. He took his hand, though he could hardly feel it, and raised it to Jayce's face. He hoped he was holding it. It was becoming too hard to see. Jayce, don't cry for me. Smile. Please. A sob racked through Jayce's body as he heard Viktor's request. He tried, he really tried. He had to for Viktor, but he could feel the way his lips trembled, the way his cheeks ached and how plastic the expression felt, how fake and forced it was. He couldn't stop the way his eyes still spilled tears and the way his brows pinched so hard at the bridge it hurt. We still have so much to do, Viktor. You're my partner. I need you. Viktor kept his hands on Jayce's face, but it was getting harder to hold his hand up. His vision was becoming more dark than light. I know, Jayce. He stopped to take in a harsh breath that didn't quite fill his lungs. I need you too. Viktor's breathing became rapid and fast. He couldn't take in the oxygen he needed, and Jayce looked down at his knees as Viktor's blood had spread so far out it was staining his slacks. He felt the warm wetness seep into his clothing. No, Viktor, stay awake, please. You can't go yet. Jayce wanted to shake Viktor, to wake him up, like he was playing some horrible joke, and if only Jayce could get him to break character, would this nightmare end? Viktor's eyes were closing, but he seemed to be fighting something, desperately clawing at the shreds of whatever was left. He took one last shuddering breath. I love you, Jayce. Then his voice grew quiet, and his hand fell from Jayce's face. It only stayed up because of Jayce's hand cupped over it. He could feel the sudden weight of it, see how Viktor's elbow sagged and hung there weakly. His eyes fell closed. If it weren't for the ash and the blood coating his skin, he might have almost looked relaxed. Jayce clutched at Viktor's hands, squeezing it, trying to feel the warmth from his body closer to his, but Viktor was already growing cold. He had faded so fast. It was to the effect of snapping his fingers rather than something that fades away like clouds covering the sun. This wasn't what he thought death was like. He ran his hands frantically through Viktor's hair. He didn't know what it would achieve, but he just needed to hold Viktor. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. They were supposed to still have time. He was supposed to help Viktor, to cure his disease. He was supposed to survive. Jayce was supposed to save him. He wasn't supposed to go yet. Jayce bent over Viktor's body, touching his forehead to Viktor's. Viktor had told him about the gesture from his home, but Viktor wouldn't even know he'd done it. I love you too, Viktor, he said softly. His shoulders began to shake as sobbing racked through his body, heaving, gasping sounds that were choking him. He felt like he was drowning, surrounded by Viktor's blood and his own tears that stained his face and the snot that coated his nose. This wasn't supposed to happen. The pain and anguish built up in his chest, and he tucked his head into the crook of Viktor's shoulder and screamed. A harrowing sound that echoed through the open room. The sound ripped at his throat as his vocal cords protested at the volume. He could only hear his voice, but he wanted to hear Viktor's. He needed Viktor to tell him it was okay, that he was okay. He could still see Viktor smiling at him from his place beside him in the lab. He wanted to escape into the memory. He wanted to hide in it and pretend it was still real and leave this nightmare behind. But he couldn't. This was too real, too vivid, and the memory was unclear and faded in comparison, like a photo stained with blood. He would switch between screaming, the spit flying from his open mouth and raw throat, and sobbing, with his head pressed to Viktor's. At one point he even placed a kiss on Viktor's forehead, but nothing he did could take back the fact that Viktor was gone. His partner had died in this room, and nothing could change the fact that he was now crying over a corpse, the husk of the person Viktor used to be. At some point someone touched his arm. He hadn't even heard them approach. He whipped around, smacking their arm away from him, snarling at whoever had disturbed him. His lips curled over his teeth and his eyebrows furrowed to the point it hurt his stinging eyes. He looked up to see Mel standing there, her hand dropped back and her eyes heavy with sadness and slight fear. When he realised it was her, his face slackened into fear and regret. He hadn't meant to hit her. Ashamed, he turned away from her and clutched Viktor to him tighter, holding his body up on his knees as he tilted his head to rest on Viktor's chest, silently begging to hear his heart beating between his ribs. But it was silent. There was nothing. He felt someone touch him again, and he almost stood to attack them, but he saw that it was a Noxian shoulder. He hissed at them, words escaping him, his emotions consuming him to the point of animalistic reactions. The soldier took him by the arm and hauled him up to his feet. Jayce desperately tried to pull against the soldier's grip. They were taking him away from Viktor. He couldn't leave him. Not again. "Get off me!" He growled as he yanked his own arm and attempted to bat away the soldier's vice. But another soldier grabbed his arm and kept him from hitting the previous soldier. "I can't do that, Councillor Tallis," he said in a blank, husky voice before he pulled him away from Viktor. Jayce yelled and kicked as they tried to take him away, looking over his shoulder at Viktor and to Mel, who was still standing behind him, her eyes still wide, staring at him as he was pulled away. He couldn't go. They had to let him go. He needed to stay with Viktor. He couldn't leave him. He wouldn't abandon him. Not again. He kicked the soldiers hard in the shins, and in the momentary lapse he was able to yank his arms free. He fell to his knees and scrambled up quickly to his feet, running back to Viktor, rolling his ankle on the surrounding debris as he fell by Viktor's side once more. But again he was yanked to his feet, this time by Rictus. Rictus held him like he was a rag doll, something made of fabric and straw, precariously held together with thin string. He was marched away from Viktor again, and this time he hung there limply, merely watching as Viktor disappeared from view as he was shoved out of the council room. That is all from me for now, my darlings. I hope your day or night is wonderful, and I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you all soon. Bye.